Okay, good afternoon, everybody. As Lucas mentioned earlier, I am Dwayne Moore. I'm a professor in the philosophy department, and it's a pleasure to be able to introduce our panelists and our moderator today, and also just the general theme of our first panel. The first panel discussion is on recreational marijuana. Some context. In December 2015, the Trudeau-led Liberal government designated marijuana legalization as a priority during its first speech from the throne. The government is now studying the issue, building coalitions within and outside government, and examining the options for possible implementations. The possible legalization of marijuana for recreational purpose is the subject matter of this first panel. As far as the participants in our panel, I'll just introduce, first of all, the moderator. You've already met him if you were here earlier. Dr. Lucas Richert is an instructor in the history department and teaches on the history of medicine and the history of drugs, among other things. Also, Dan Malik, who's an assistant professor at Brock University in health sciences, but also teaches the history of medicine and health policy, has written 2 books related to these themes, including Try to Control Yourself and When Good Drugs Go Bad. Sarah Hoffman is a professor in the philosophy department, and she has research interests in philosophy of mathematics and science, philosophy of sexuality and feminism, and also plans to teach a course on drugs in the near future. And then finally, Sean Tremblath has been writing for the Saskatoon Star Phoenix for 4 years. He covers a wide variety of topics for the paper and contributes many of the cover stories featured in Bridges, which is a weekly magazine published by the Star Phoenix. He has been involved in much of the Star Phoenix's marijuana coverage over the past few years. And so I'll take it away first. Dr. Dan Malik is going to speak for about 8 minutes, and then the others will go. And then please save all questions for a discussion time at the end.
Okay, hello. Is this thing on?
No. No.
Then how can you hear me? Is this thing on? Is this thing on? Hello? So, next. Moving on. Who's next? Hi. Hi. Oh man, don't put me in front of a microphone too often. So, I apologize if you were here last night. I don't apologize if you were here last night. I apologize if you were here last night. I'm going to repeat a few of the things I talked about last night, partly because I didn't pay attention to the instructions we were given and I didn't know we were going to be doing an opening statement, partly because I'm kind of a one-trick pony when it comes to this topic. That last bit I think was a joke. You tell me. So I come at this from someone who studied liquor control and liquor regulation after Prohibition. The subtitle of the book you just heard, the book is called Try to Control Yourself, the Origin or the Regulation of, what is it called? The Regulation of Public Drinking in Post-Prohibition Ontario. So, but I also study drug laws, and the opium book, When Good Drugs Go Bad, the subtitle is Opium Medicine and the Origins of Canada's Drug Laws. So I look at kind of the creation of one law and the end of another set of laws. And a lot of what when I listen to the issue of cannabis legalization, I've heard a lot of things that resonated for me, where the ideas about cannabis and the way some people were characterizing cannabis, not the students, by the way, there was like unanimity, right, on their views. When people characterize cannabis as a negative influence, or they talk about gateway drugs, or they talk about these other social impacts that drugs have on society, I just think about the same sorts of rhetoric from the temperance movement and the prohibition movement 150 years ago, right? And I think it's interesting because alcohol was this incredibly feared, dangerous, and incredibly popular substance. And we ended a period of rapid temperance agitation with Prohibition. And after Prohibition, when people say it failed, some people argue it didn't fail, but when it ended, they had to create a new system to deal with this still socially problematic substance. And when I say socially problematic, I don't mean that that it was necessarily causing a lot of trouble, but that people perceived a lot of problems in it. So in all provinces actually, they created a liquor control board of some kind, and some of them have changed in what they do. And what I found in the work in Ontario, and I know I'm not in Ontario, and Dr. Erica Dick has accused me of being an ignorant Upper Canadian. She didn't use the word ignorant, but you know, but what I study is Ontario, so I'm just talking about one example. We'll have that regionalism discussion later. Is that I approached the topic thinking what I was going to read was, because I was reading these detailed records from hotel regulation and beverage room regulation, and I thought what I was going to read was this sort of temperance-minded group of stern bureaucrats saying, you know, don't drink. You know, don't drink there, don't drink there, don't drink there. Well, yeah, we'll let you do it, but don't drink. But what I found was that these people saying, well, you know, yeah, we want you to be able to drink, but you just need to kind of do it to alleviate a lot of the problems. Mm-hmm. And to make a very long, 305-page book, I realized the other day, story short, the outcome was the sort of a reconstruction of people's relationship with alcohol. And understanding that, yeah, you can drink, you can enjoy yourself, just as the title says, try to control yourself, right? Like, do it in a way that is responsible and respectable. And by doing that, I argued, you are sort of engaging in a form of citizenship, right? You are still being a good citizen drinker, and I use the term citizen drinker. And so I look at that and think, how could that model apply to cannabis legalization? I thought, because even though we see a lot of the numbers about the percentage of people who think cannabis should be legalized, and there's a lot of concerns about how it can be legalized, there is still a lot of negative stigma or concerns around cannabis. So one approach I suggest is this liquor control model as a way of redirecting or sort of reframing the way people think about cannabis. And then, if history is any predictor, and you know, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, over time, as generations become more familiar with cannabis as a legal substance and become see that it wasn't as big a problem as, or if we learn that it wasn't as big a problem as people thought it would be, then rules would be loosened up and restrictions would change, right? So it requires sort of what we call a paradigm shift or a cultural shift in that way. So I don't know if that was 8 minutes, but that's enough. Lucas is like, yeah, that was 8 minutes, Malik. To me, that was like 2 minutes, right? So I'll stop talking now.
My turn? Is this, now mine is working. Hopefully I won't talk for too long. I should start out though by saying I'm kind of a living, breathing stereotype. I'm a philosophy professor who gets stoned. So I'm gonna be perfectly honest about that. Although I say that not just to be, oh, look at me, but actually to say, but I don't actually anymore. I haven't broken any Canadian drug laws in several years, actually. And so what the remarks I'm going to be making, which are very, very in favor of legalization, aren't just self-serving, oh, I want to be able to do what I like to do, because I'm not interested in using the substance myself any longer. And in fact, I wish I hadn't used it as much as I did in my life. I'm almost 50 now. I wish I hadn't started so young. I think it's had some negative effects on me. And I think, in fact, there are some real risks involved with cannabis that are often not acknowledged, especially for young people. If I had a child who was a teenager, I would far rather, there are probably a dozen drugs I would prefer that they use before cannabis, none of them legal. And the legal ones, I certainly wouldn't want them using. Alcohol is a poison. So is tobacco. Sorry if I'm treading on anybody's toes, but I'm a living, breathing stereotype in a few ways. So, yeah, let me say about recreational cannabis. I can see the reasons why, the political reasons largely, although there are others, why efforts, particularly in the States, but not just in the States, towards decriminalizing cannabis have focused on the medical side, right? Because of the way drug criminalization happened, because certain substances have been treated as in a category of having no recognized or accepted medical use, right? And the fact is that cannabis actually does have some real promise in a number of areas medically. The next panel is going to talk about that more than us. So I can understand that, but I have a very principled stand on cannabis, but actually, just to be upfront about another perhaps contentious thing, I think all drugs should be legalized. Across the board. Yes, I mean heroin. Yes, I mean cocaine. Yes, I mean methamphetamine. Actually, methamphetamine basically is legal now. They just call it ADHD drugs, and they give it to 6-year-olds, which I'm not very happy about particularly. I'm less worried about the people in their 20s and 30s I know who are addicted to meth, although I wish they had a clean legal supply if they're going to choose to do that. Anyway, why do I have that kind of a stand? Well, I'll try not to get diverted onto the other drugs. But the 2 reasons. I think harm reduction. Harm reduction is absolutely central. Human beings want to alter their consciousness. Not just human beings, mammals, possibly even flatworms and ants and other living creatures. It seems to be a drive that is present in animals, including human animals. And it seems relatively inelastic in relation to legal intervention of various kinds. And criminalizing that kind of behavior and the kinds of falsehoods and propaganda that are required to try to trick people into thinking that there are risks that there aren't. Right? And putting those substances into the hands of criminals, people who are willing to make money doing criminal things. They tend to be willing to do other types of criminal things, like violent things and so forth. That just increases harms. So there's a whole bunch of complicated arguments, but they kind of all come down to that. I think that almost any harm that I see, almost any, not any, but almost any harm that I see related to drug use and abuse seems to me to be just made worse by using the criminal justice system to try to control people's behavior. And many new harms are introduced, like, for example, a criminal record. It's worse in some other countries, not to mention the USA or anything. But those harms are real. Families are destroyed. People are destroyed. And frankly, another admission, I know some people who do things like sell heroin in the States. They're not bad people. They're doing it because they have criminal records. They can't vote. They can't get employment. They can't get housing if they're honest. Pardon my language, but why the fuck not sell heroin? That's not the world I want to live in. Right? I want to live in the world where things like that aren't, we're not creating those harms. But the second, perhaps more philosophical.
I think that we may have to move on to Sean now.
Just let me mention one phrase and I'll be done. Freedom of consciousness. I think that human beings, adult human beings, should have the freedom to choose their own state of consciousness. And the fact that some people want to get stoned, I don't think it's for the government to tell them they shouldn't. That's the other reason.
Thank you. Thank you.
Hello. All right. Hi, guys. I've been asked to come here and talk about, I guess, a journalistic perspective. I suppose I should start with an admission. Up to now, the coverage that me and really the Star Phoenix and most media outlets here have done has focused largely on medical marijuana. That's just because that's sort of an issue that's really happening in our community right now. Now that said, with the Trudeau government's commitment to legalizing, this is something that we're going to be seeing more and more of. And as that story unfolds, we journalists are going to be a big part of telling that story. I mean, I guess really the story of legal marijuana in Canada is yet to be told. As a topic, it really excites me for a couple reasons. One of the main things is this is something that kind of touches so many areas of society. I mean, if I think of it in terms of sections in the newspaper, really we can talk about marijuana obviously in the news section, the business section as it becomes legal and people are selling it. It's very relevant there. The arts and culture section, I mean, there already is a huge marijuana culture, and as it becomes sort of more normalized, watching how that advances is going to be really interesting. And I mean, even in the sports section, there's discussions being had now about whether marijuana should be considered a performance-enhancing drug, particularly in sports like martial arts. So yeah, I'm just excited to see what happens. If you want to see, this is already kind of being done in the U.S. I would recommend anyone interested in the topic check out what the Denver Post has been doing. They've got a website called The Cannabis. I believe it's thecannabis.com or cannabis.com. They've got a marijuana editor at the Denver Post. They've really dived in, and it's a great resource for all of the things I'm talking about. I mean, check my notes. I see I'm the only one with notes here. Sorry about that. So, I mean, I guess really, from a journalistic perspective, there's no sort of special approach to marijuana as far as I'm concerned. I mean, really, right now in Canada, this is a campaign promise that the new federal government made. It's going to shake out in a way that some people are going to like, other people's aren't going to like, other people's, yes. And we will be telling those stories, hopefully, in as balanced a way as we can. And really, a lot of the stories, we don't even know what they're going to be. I mean, using the U.S. as an example again, as I was researching this, I mean, a study was published recently out of Cornell and San Diego State that found that the states that legalized marijuana have had a decrease in obesity rates, which is something you wouldn't, necessarily associate, especially with the stereotype of eating pizza and whatnot. So these type of sort of things we haven't even thought of yet is what we're really going to have to tackle as all this shakes down. And let's get some questions.
Yeah, let's get some questions. So has anyone been interested in any of the things that has been said just yet? And if so, raise your hand, and by all means, raise your voice as well. Back there. Yep. Oh, I caught you with your mouth full, sorry.
So a question, I don't know those names. Regarding freedom of consciousness, how is that, we're going to be marijuana specific here. I know it's more of a general statement, but how would you say that ties in with big campaigns to legalize cannabis in Canada?
Well, I suppose I see it as prohibition laws that prohibit the use of drugs, whatever drug, are paternalistic attempts to dissuade people from altering their consciousness in various ways. I mean, so it's the imposition or the substitution of the judgment of the government or the people who know better for the individual over what kind of states of consciousness are ones that they should choose to enjoy or endure. And so I see it as like freedom of consciousness. It's the freedom of an individual to choose for themselves what state of consciousness they want to experience, endure, explore, enjoy.
Dan, you're nodding your head a little bit.
Yes.
How do you feel about that?
No, I agree. And I think one of the things we sometimes don't ask enough are some of those core questions, like why do we think that mind-altering substances should be restricted, right? Like, well, not we, but I mean, as a culture, we accept a lot of these restrictions, or we see a lot of these restrictions and don't say, well, what's wrong with mind-altering, with, you know, psychotropic or that sort. And so that's core, right? And so some of us think, wow, that's a weird question to ask, but why is it a problem, right? Why is there harm in that? And just the simple choice of, and I'm not questioning it. I agree. We should be asking that question, and I don't think many people would come up with a really good answer that you know, we could ask around here about that would be satisfying, that would justify the level of
That way madness
restriction.
lies.
Well.
One answer.
There's all sorts of, you know, historical roots in Judeo-Christian thought around, you know, the way you treat your body, but those kind of collapse when you look at the excessive law, the excess of the law on those sorts of, caused by those sorts of ideas. Whoa.
We have questions there, sir.
Don't you think that the laws were in large part a response to just globalization? So we were a culture of alcohol, and we had other peoples coming in, bringing other things, like the Mexicans and the blacks primarily were responsible for marijuana. Like, don't you think this was a response that tried to preserve the British nature of Canada and to plant a flag in the ground? Because at the same time we were doing these laws, they were in Germany, but there was a lot of sort of nationalism that's totally forgotten now.
Except for me.
I'm not sure who that's for. That's a jump ball, I think.
I can jump. He was looking at me. Yeah. As the historian,
Yeah.
I mean, I do talk about race a lot.
The fear of the unknown and the attempt to preserve some sort of cultural purity. And it turned into this whole industry of prisons and police and drug workers and biker gangs, and now it's just a huge mess.
Yeah. So there are a couple common and probably overly simple histories of drug laws, and I don't say simplistic. It's like we have these ideas that they're easy things to say. That relate to conspiracy theories, right? And no, but I'm just trying to frame this for you. So you get this kind of, these laws were racist, full stop. And there were concerns about outsiders, absolutely. Our drug laws were based upon concerns about other cultures and other things that were going on. But there were also concerns about national decline and weakness, physical weakness caused by drugs and alcohol. It was part of a movement, and alcohol was a much bigger concern, but it was also something that was much more popular, right? So when the drug laws came about, I don't want to get into, you're right, there was a racial component to it, but if we just say they are racist, then we lose a lot of the other complexity behind the creation of drug laws. I'm sorry if I'm talking like this, right? I'm sorry. We lose some of that complexity. So as a professional historian, my job is to make sure we recognize the complexity, because if we don't, then when we go to look at policy change, we just go, oh, well, let's just change the law, it's fine, without understanding that there's a lot of interwoven layers there. I guess that
Right, and
just
economic
circles down.
layers as well.
There's economic
right,
layers,
because this is
political,
something
social,
that
cultural.
Brent raised as well in his keynote when it comes to hemp versus
Well, that
fibers,
is
right?
probably the biggest
Yeah, so this is-
myth that
yeah.
We can talk about. another time.
And so one thing I would ask Sean is, I mean, the coverage of this. And can you speak a little bit about different kinds of coverage in the media, in different media outlets? Or is that an unfair question?
Could you clarify the question? Sorry, what exactly do you mean?
Are we seeing in post-media news a different kind of coverage than in other news outlets?
Well, I'd say that every news outlet, I guess the specific coverage you get is usually based on the specific journalist doing the coverage. I know that there's a sense that on a day-to-day basis, stories are affected by, the guy at the top of the chain. In my experience, that's not the truth. In fact, if I was writing a story about marijuana or anything else, and word came down that we weren't going to publish it because, the guy at the top said so, there would be a riot in the newsroom. And that's my experience. I can't speak to every news outlet.
Yeah.
In terms of, I guess, sort of how the coverage looks, obviously sort of old media that I'm a part of has a certain tone that's largely defined by the people that have been doing it through the years. And then when you look at, say, a newer outlet, I guess the one that jumps to mind is, say, Vice. They've got
I see, yeah.
a tone very much defined by the people making it. Again, and they, because they were created much more recently, have just a different history and a different sort of tone that they've developed.
So can I push you just a bit more on that? So if you have this new type of media, and a younger generation is consuming this new type of media, how does that influence or shape what the general consensus is around legalization? I mean, I know it's a difficult question, but is it something that you talk about in the newsroom?
Well, general consensus is a pretty ephemeral idea, right? I mean, what is the general consensus?
Yeah.
When it comes down to it, I mean, we're trying as best we can to find the truth and write about it. I mean, that's sort of the fundamental theory of journalism, right? You become a journalist because you believe the best way to better the world is to present the truth as best as you can find it.
So when we talk about recreational cannabis, one discussion is dispensaries model versus the LP model. Open to anybody to talk about that.
So this is a jump ball as well. I guess the licensed producers versus dispensary.
I guess one thing I would look at is from previous presentation and other LPs in Canada, they are producers, but they also have a company where they're actually selling. So that company that's selling isn't really a licensed producer. They're more of a dispensary, online dispensary versus a producer. Your thoughts on that, I guess?
We can hear a pin drop. I'm not sure if that's a good thing, or maybe what we'll do is we'll put that question in the parking lot and we'll come back to it in the next panel. That's a good question.
I can say I'm very interested to see what happens, but as for predictions, I don't know. I mean, you see examples of both in the U.S. I mean, I guess or maybe not both strictly defined, but Denver, for instance, has a much more kind of wide open system. We've seen that sort of, that's a very capitalist way to do it, right? And as a result, it's generated a shitload of money. As for what's best, it's hard to say. Again, it kind of depends how you define that.
Here first.
You said that you had some negative implications on your life because of using marijuana too young. Do you think if there were laws in place that maybe would have happened?
There were laws in place. I'm 50 almost, so I was breaking the law from about 14, smoking the weed.
I mean, like, if it was legal and if it was controlled, do you think that maybe that would have?
I think if there had been more good information, I mean, I'm not a stupid person. I mean, we're all stupid in certain ways, but even at 14, I think I would have been interested in the science, and I certainly didn't learn any of it, really. Not in school, that's for sure. So I think if we had a context that was where society was genuinely committed to harm reduction, which I think involves giving people as much of the truth as we have, and even to the youngins, I think you can be. And if you've got things like Reefer Madness, that crazy film, we haven't had that kind of stereotype so much recently, but there have been a lot of falsehoods perpetuated. Cannabis probably is a gateway drug, but it's a gateway drug to cigarettes, actually. in places where there isn't a lot of vaping. So that's. But yeah, I think those things could be helped. I mean, maybe not for particular individual people, but in a certain way, harm reduction efforts are really aimed at the collective and at reducing rates of certain kinds of harms, right? I think there's always going to be problems with drugs in society in terms of people. I mean, drugs solve a lot of problems. Drugs are great, right? That's why they cause so many problems, because they don't keep solving the problems, right? They give people a lot of pleasure. They disengage us from activities that are more meaningful and satisfying in certain kinds of way. They connect us to things that can become problematic. And I think if we talked more openly about those things and talked about why altering our consciousnesses in certain sorts of ways can be a risky thing to do, especially if it's done habitually, right? And then if we talked about those things, I think those harms could be reduced somewhat, yeah.
Sir?
Yeah, just on the issue of law, when the prohibition was lifted on alcohol, there were suddenly all these restrictions put in, and there's been this intensifying of laws dealing with impaired driving. Now, with legalization of cannabis or the normalization of it, I see a potential problem with the whole drug industry, because there are all kinds of pharmaceuticals that people are prescribed every day which impair you far greater than cannabis does, yet people are allowed to drive on them. Are the police going to have to start looking at all impairment when you're dealing with driving?
Well, I'm not a criminologist, so I can't feel too much credibility in speaking, but I've got a microphone, so I'll try. I think if you ask police officers, that when we talk about impaired driving, we talk about not only driving under the influence of alcohol, right? So people can be impaired and not be just having consumed alcohol. So I think that's where that is. Well, the concern with things like cannabis, and this is an issue they were dealing with, and they are dealing or addressing it in Colorado, for example, is does the detection mechanisms, are they effective? Like, and right now they're still working out whether, you know, cannabis, I understand cannabis stays in some people's systems longer than others, even long after they're impaired and things like that. So it's tougher to deal with, right? But I think within the criminal justice system, they're concerned about impaired driving beyond. So if someone is impaired because of a prescription drug they were taking, theoretically they could be busted for that. I don't know if that happens. Like I said, I'm not a criminologist. That's the best I can do. What's that?
Another upside.
There was a study done in 1956 by the Washington State Traffic Board, and they used 2 levels of cannabis, 1 placebo, and an ounce of flat alcohol as a comparison. And they found that the people who got the really good pot were the safest drivers.
Because they were going 20 miles an hour.
They just check their environment more often. More alert.
I think that's a good example of the type of thing we're going to learn more about, you know, a couple years after this all shakes out again. It's possible that there will be a rash of high driving accidents. You know, we don't know. I suspect that may not be the case, but 5 years after legalization happens, we're going to have a hell of a lot better idea of just how big of an issue it is.
A question in the back there, sir?
One of my questions, just to speak on that, and there's like, obviously I don't have sources to cite, but there's been studies to show that like you really learn something, you like do something high, so I learned to drive standard high, and then I forgot after that. But one of my questions, basically like, you keep hearing people using alcohol as like a benchmark for what we should be doing with marijuana. But what do you think of like treating more like psychoactive substance like coffee or like more socially accepted than that, and then taking away that air of it that might cause younger people to want to do it, rather than like giving people a choice to develop a taste for it?
So moving beyond the alcohol and cannabis comparison and trying to look for other types of...
Like even more accepted, like apples you can get off the counter. Coffee is like a psychoactive substance that is like widely accepted. Kind of looking into that even more so to deter from glamorizing it.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing that Dr. Erica Dick in the history department, the Canada Research Chair, has written about is LSD within Saskatchewan. So maybe there is another example of a drug that is potentially being normalized right now because you're seeing more and more scientific studies in major research institutions. Say it.
There's not enough research on LSD and MDMA and substances like that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think the shift you're talking about is largely a cultural one. It's what you spoke about in your opening statements. I mean, the fact is, I don't know if I'm going to be able to convince my grandmother that weed is not as bad as alcohol or worse or whatever. And as generations shift, again, we are assuming this becomes legal and sort of a common thing. People will start to see, both because there's plenty of people who will use it themselves who wouldn't have because it was illegal. People will just start to gain a better understanding of the reality of the substance.
Back there, first of all.
Thanks. I'm curious if the panel can comment on the sort of relative shifts. So we were talking about like the 1950s and even earlier in the 1930s regulating drugs and alcohol. But since the 1950s, we have embraced a whole world of drugs. And so a generation has gone by where we hardly have people who haven't taken any drugs, legal or otherwise, particularly pharmaceutical substances. So are we in a new era of drug literacy that will also help to legalize, decriminalize, and differently regulate these drugs than we have seen in the past? If we take the precedent from the past, we're maybe looking at the wrong things. I say as a historian.
Which things should we be looking at?
Well, I think there's some lessons about, the kind of evidence that evidence-based policymaking instead of moral panic-based policymaking. So whether we regulate, coffee or marijuana or LSD or psilocybin or whatever it might be, it just seems that this new generation has really taken a lot more drugs in our lives already. As kids, we're so used to drugs, we have such a higher literacy, so to speak, in terms of drug taking, and we trust the regulators to make these decisions more so than we ever did in the 1950s and the 30s. And some of these things were quite new. So I'm just curious about, how that changes the regulatory framework, how we make these decisions. We shouldn't be as bothered by moral panics now. We have so much more information available to us.
Yeah.
Wow, we could talk for a long time, and we may, about that.
I think one of the risks that I see in having a system where we have some drugs given the stamp of approval of being legal, right, and others not, is that people presume because something's legal that it's safe, which is complete bollocks. Right? I mean, more people have to have liver transplants because of Tylenol than almost any other substance known to man. Right? And last I checked, Tylenol is pretty legal. Right? And so in a certain way, I resist your description of drug literate. Right? Maybe drug experienced, right? Drug addled even, but not drug literate enough. Although the potential certainly is there. Internet, etc.
I think that it's also worth and you could probably talk on this a lot too.
I could.
But yeah, but you invited us to talk.
I did
so we're
invite
supposed
you
to-
guys.
He's the expert, you know.
Yeah.
She just wants to get him in on the conversation. But I think, yeah, the idea of drug literacy is fascinating, and the fact that we have these columns. Column A is illegal or highly controlled. Column B is prescription. Column C is, you know, buy it at the corner store or wherever you buy them. And it creates this medicalized notion of what is a legitimate use for a substance, right? So the question about coffee could go the other way. At what point does coffee become controlled because it's, you know, it's going to perk kids up a little too much, you know? So
When they're smoking it on Vice.
they do that?
Vice did a story.
What's that like?
It's
It
a bad idea.
okay,
Don't smoke the
okay,
coffee.
I won't smoke it. But yeah, so don't smoke your coffee, and don't drink your. No, you can do that. But yeah, so I mean, that's such a complex question, but it just makes me think about the way we frame legitimate and illegitimate use of something, right? So during Prohibition, the licensing authorities, the alcohol prohibition, licensing authorities spent a lot of time talking to pharmacists and watching pharmacists and how much they were distributing, how much alcohol they were distributing, right? Because the only legitimate use was through medical. So when that ended, there was really no discussion of medical alcohol. It very quickly disappeared, even though up until that point it was, right?
And where are the cocaine hair tonics?
Cocaine hair tonic. So
Yeah,
cocaine toothpaste is even a better one. Yeah, because it actually is cocaine's one of the most effective, if not the most effective, topical anesthetic, right? So it was highly used. We could go into that as well.
And let me just say, on one point you made, it's true, there's a lot more information out there, but as someone who spends a lot of time on the internet, both personally and professionally, moral panic is not going anywhere. It is amplified as much as it's ever been.
But it is an interesting idea that panic can I mean, not an interesting idea isn't dismissive, but if we can remove the idea of panic and just have some kind of systematic, rigorous, the first thing that needs to happen is everything has to be legalized, because until you do that, you've got these circles of criminality that surround and sort of affect our understanding of a substance. You know, if the only place you can get it is from some shadowy pusher that is just trying to sell you other stuff because that's the way he markets his product, then you can't ever really get away from those moral panics, right? If you create a system that is, rigorously regulated but legal, then you can start to talk about more of these, maybe get away from those panics. Maybe you never can. I don't know. I mean, you'll always find something to be freaked out about, right?
I think we have to end on the concept of shadowy pusher.
No. Give us another one.
Oh, is that it?
Yeah, that's our time. Might you join me in thanking our first panelists?
Thank you.
There will be another panel discussion in about 3 or 4 minutes. We're just going to shift panelists. And if you still have questions for them, talk to them in person or afterwards. But we'll be back in about 3 or 4 minutes with a new set of discussion topics.